There is a moment, rare, destabilizing, when certainty fractures. Not with noise, but with a silence so precise it feels deliberate. It often arrives disguised as humility, as a sentence you never rehearsed. I may have been wrong about what reality is. This isn't the wrongness of an error corrected. It's the wrongness of a map dissolving while you're still standing on the terrain. The coordinates that once held steady, object here, subject there, matter first, mind second, begin to blur, not from confusion, but from an unfamiliar clarity. For some, this moment comes through years of contemplation. For others, through loss, illness, or proximity to death. And for a growing number, it arrives through a sudden alteration of consciousness, a shift so total that the ordinary world doesn't vanish, but is quietly demoted. What replaces it doesn't feel imaginary, it feels authoritative, hyper-real, as if the depth slider of existence has been turned up, revealing layers that were always present but carefully hidden behind usefulness. The walls don't melt, time doesn't stop. Instead, meaning intensifies, presence thickens, reality seems to look back. And that is the unsettling part. Because if consciousness can enter a state that feels more real than waking life, more coherent, more meaningful, more true, then the question is no longer whether the experience is valid. The question is what kind of reality requires such tight filtering to function at all. Perhaps what cracks in these moments isn't the world, but the assumption that we were ever seeing it whole. The thesis of hyperreality. The experience of hyperreality does not announce itself as a theory. It arrives without footnotes, without arguments, without permission, and that is precisely why it unsettles the modern scientific mind. Science is trained to trust what can be shared, measured, and repeated. Hyperreality, by contrast, is intimate. It convinces not through proof, but through presence. For centuries, the dominant assumption has been that consciousness is a late arrival in a material universe, an emergent glow produced by neural machinery once it becomes sufficiently complex. Matter is solid, external, primary. Mind is secondary, private, fragile. Hyperreality inverts that order. In these states, consciousness no longer feels like a byproduct of the world. It feels like the medium through which the world appears at all. Objects feel less fundamental than awareness itself. Space and time feel like patterns within experience, not containers surrounding it. The usual hierarchy, brain first, mind second, loses its intuitive force. This does not mean hyperreality proves that consciousness is fundamental. It does not certify any metaphysical system. But it does something more subtle and more dangerous. It weakens the exclusivity of physicalism. It shows that the sense of what is real can be radically reweighted without collapsing into chaos. And if reality can feel more real when the brain's ordinary constraints are loosened, then the everyday world begins to look less like an objective given and more like a negotiated interface, stable, reliable, but incomplete. Hyperreality, then, is not a revelation of truth. It is a revelation of contingency. It suggests that what we call reality may not be false, but it may be filtered far more aggressively than we were ever taught to question. The scientific bridge of constructed perception. Long before altered states entered laboratories, neuroscience had already begun to erode the idea that perception is a passive window onto the world. The brain does not wait for reality to arrive, it anticipates it. What we experience as sight, sound, and solidity is not a recording, but a best guess, continuously updated, rarely questioned. In this view, perception is not discovery, but inference. Sensory data arrives incomplete and ambiguous, and the nervous system fills the gaps using prior expectations shaped by biology, culture, and survival. The world feels stable not because it is directly given, but because the brain is remarkably good at hiding its own work. Hyperreality interferes with that concealment. When the predictive machinery is disrupted, experience doesn't dissolve into randomness, it reorganizes. Patterns emerge that feel internally coherent, even if they no longer serve survival or utility. Meaning becomes foreground. The familiar world recedes, not because it was destroyed, but because it was never the whole picture to begin with. Physics encounters a parallel tension. At the smallest scales, observation cannot be separated from outcome. Measurement is not a neutral act. It participates. The world described by equations behaves differently depending on how it is questioned. Reality, at least at its foundations, is not entirely observer-independent. This does not imply that consciousness creates the universe, but it does suggest that the universe we experience is inseparable from the way it is accessed. Hyperreality sharpens this insight experientially. It exposes the scaffolding of perception, reminding us that what feels obvious is often the most heavily constructed layer of all. The mystery of universals and archetypal geometry. One of the most difficult details to dismiss is not the strangeness of altered states, but their consistency. Across cultures, languages, and belief systems, people report encounters with remarkably similar forms: geometric lattices, serpentine structures, vaulted spaces that feel architectural yet alive. These patterns appear not as vague impressions, but with a specificity that surprises even those who experience them. This raises an uncomfortable question. If these states are merely private hallucinations, why do they so often rhyme? Why do individuals with no shared mythology describe comparable spatial motifs, comparable transitions, comparable thresholds of dissolution and return? Randomness rarely organizes itself this way. One explanation points inward. Human nervous systems share deep structural constraints. Visual cortices process information in similar ways. Disruptions to those circuits may naturally generate recurring geometries. In this account, universals are artifacts of shared biology. The brain, untethered from its usual inputs, begins to reveal its own architecture. But that explanation does not fully settle the matter. Some reported features appear too structured, too narratively coherent to be easily reduced to neural noise. They behave less like glitches and more like environments, spaces with rules, progression, and internal logic. Another interpretation looks outward, toward psychology rather than physiology. Carl Jung proposed that beneath personal memory lies a deeper layer of the psyche, patterns of meaning shaped not by individual lives, but by shared human inheritance. Archetypes are not images we invent, but structures that shape imagination itself. Whether these universals arise from neural symmetry, psychological depth, or something not yet understood, they challenge the idea that experience is entirely idiosyncratic. Hyperreality may be private, but it is not arbitrary, and that distinction matters. The discipline of meaning after ecstasy. Every altered state ends the same way, by releasing you back into the ordinary. The room reappears, language regains its edges, the body remembers its weight, and what remains is not revelation itself but the question of what to do with it. This is where meaning becomes dangerous. A powerful experience can clarify, but it can also inflate. History is crowded with people who mistook intensity for authority, certainty for truth. The difference between awakening and disintegration is rarely found in the experience itself, but in what follows. There is a discipline required after ecstasy, a willingness to doubt what felt unquestionable, a commitment to return to shared reality rather than retreat into private conviction. The mind must be strong enough to hold the experience without surrendering judgment to it. Clinical psychology draws a necessary line here. Some altered states deepen understanding, others fracture coherence. Hyperreality can coexist with humility, or it can metastasize into delusion. The difference is not mystical, it is behavioral. Does the experience integrate you back into life, or pull you away from it? Does it sharpen care, or erode responsibility? This is why rigor matters, not as a cage, but as a stabilizer. Science, philosophy, and mental health are not enemies of transcendence. They are guardrails that prevent insight from collapsing into narcissism or despair. To wash the dishes after touching something vast is not a betrayal of the experience. it is the proof that it didn't break you. Meaning that cannot survive, the return to the ordinary was never as deep as it felt. Quantum biology and the edge of the possible. At the boundary where experience presses against explanation, biology becomes less settled than we once assumed. Life, long treated as a purely classical affair, has begun to reveal behaviours that sit uncomfortably close to the quantum domain, not as metaphors, but as experimentally testable questions. Certain biological processes appear to exploit effects that, in other contexts, are fragile and fleeting. Photosynthesis, for example, shows evidence of quantum coherence in energy transfer, an efficiency that classical models struggle to reproduce. Migratory birds navigate using mechanisms that seem sensitive to quantum-level interactions with Earth's magnetic field. These are not speculations, they are active research programs, pursued cautiously, with instruments rather than incantations. The brain, however, remains the most contentious frontier. It is warm, wet, and noisy, conditions traditionally hostile to delicate quantum states. And yet the brain is also exquisitely sensitive, operating at thresholds where tiny differences can cascade into large-scale effects. The question is not whether the brain is quantum in some trivial sense. Everything is. But whether it uses quantum properties in ways that matter for cognition or consciousness. Some researchers propose that even if large-scale quantum coherence is absent, subtle quantum features may still shape biological function indirectly. Others remain skeptical, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary restraint. What matters here is not whether quantum biology will ultimately explain consciousness. It is that the boundary between physics and life is no longer clean. The universe does not switch rule books when chemistry becomes biology, and that alone is enough to reopen questions we thought were closed. The collapse of separation and the return to one world. When all these threads are held together, hyperreality, constructed perception, recurring forms, biological edge cases, a quieter conclusion begins to surface. Not that there are many worlds competing for attention, but that there has always been one world, approached through different apertures. The ordinary state of consciousness is not wrong, it is selective. It emphasizes continuity, identity, and utility, because those qualities keep organisms oriented and alive. Altered states loosen that selection. They do not necessarily transport the mind elsewhere. They redistribute emphasis. What was background becomes foreground. What was filtered out steps briefly into view. This reframes the mystery. The question is no longer whether psychedelics reveal a hidden universe, but why the nervous system normally hides so much of the one it already inhabits. The answer is not cosmic secrecy. It is efficiency. A mind overwhelmed by totality cannot act. It must narrow its bandwidth to function. In this light, the collapse of separation is not a metaphysical merger, but a perceptual one. Subject and object feel divided in everyday life because that division is useful. In some states, the division softens, and the world feels less like a collection of things and more like a continuous process in which the observer is already embedded. Returning from that state does not require rejecting it. It requires contextualizing it. The insight is not that the self is an illusion, nor that the world is unreal, but that both are perspectives, stable, necessary, and partial. The task is not to remain dissolved, but to remember, even faintly, that the boundary was never as solid as it seemed.